Thank you so much for coming, and I really look forward to talking to you all. As you see, there's quite a bit of data on this handout. I'm a linguist after all. And we may not get through every detail, but I want to give you a picture of the story that I'm developing and some of the main arguments for it, and hope to get your feedback on this work in progress. The main claim that I want to make, you all have a handout. If you don't, they'll be here soon, is that both directly referential semantics and the more recent anaphoric, that's a Kaplan style story, about indexicals, and the more recent anaphoric accounts of first and second person indexicals offer a picture of indexicality that's both empirically and conceptually inadequate. They fail to capture this fact. Indexicals are essentially perspectival, as reflected in the fact that first and second person indexicals are always de se. So that's what everybody's missing up to this point, and that's what I want to first argue to you, and then offer one way that you might remedy this. Surely there will be other ways one could do it. So first, just a brief review of Kaplan's framework, which most of you are probably familiar with to some extent. In David Kaplan's Semantics for Indexicals, he starts with a context, the little c in the handout here, which is a specification of the linguistically relevant parameters of a context of utterance. So you need a speaker, an addressee, a time, and a place, and a location of the utterance for, among other things, I, you, now, here, etc. Yeah? And then you need, for each expression, it has a character. And for him, character is a function from context to content, where content is the usual intentional semantics for compositional semantics of the language in question. It's usually a function from worlds or situations to truth values. Yeah? So you have your context. That's the first argument of the character. That's going to fix the values of all those indexicals given the parameters in the context. And that's going to give you the intentional content, intentional with an S, content of the expression in question. And then you proceed with your usual compositional semantics. So the character of I is a function from a given context to a content such that for all worlds the content in a given world will just be whoever the speaker is in the context. Yeah? In other words, it gives you a rigid function. Yeah? And similarly for you, whatever world the content is interpreted in is going to yield the addressee in the original context. And similarly for here and now, etc. I think that's fairly well-known framework. And it's a very powerful framework, and I called my work character assassination, but actually in homage, I call the meanings I'm going to propose characters. So, you know, really, it's just about saying that it's time that we rethink that once very fruitful approach to semantics and indexicals. And it explains the non-synonymy of examples that I've given as 1 and 2 on the handout. I might have been someone else versus the speaker might have been someone else. They're very different in truth conditions because I can never seem to take narrow scope under the modal, might, or the tense. And so you have a different content, whatever it is, on your theory, than the speaker might have been someone else, where the first one is about Craige Roberts, could have been someone else, whereas the second is about there could have been a different speaker altogether, not Craig, but yeah, someone else. Okay?
One of them is good.
Yeah, well, we'll see. A proper context for Kaplan is one in which the speaker in the context is at the location at the time of utterance, guaranteeing that for any context, we need one up here too. Is there another one? Are we all out? I have an extra here. Here. You can see that we're at one short. Yeah. So this, a proper context is one where the speaker is at the location of the utterance at the time of utterance, etc. And that's just pragmatics. That's what it is to be a speaker embodied in the world in which we live. So that guarantees that I am here now will always be true, modulo these examples about messages in a bottle and answering machines and so forth and so on. But in the normal context where we have a speaker in front of you, I am here now will always be true. Yep? Though certainly things might have been otherwise. So I am here now is always true. For example, it means Craige Roberts is in stores on March 22nd, etc. But necessarily I'm here now is not true. I could have been somewhere else. So you get the inevitable truth of I'm here now without that unpleasant necessity. Yep? So this is a very useful, powerful, insightful account. There's an alternative anaphoric account that's been coming to prominence through various authors over the last, especially couple of decades, and a lot of it through linguistic work, which is an anaphoric account in the sense that, well, you know, pronouns, I, here, and pronominal adverbials like now and here are, I and you rather, the first pronouns, are pronominal, they're anaphoric. And what happens if we require that their antecedent be something which is actually in the context of utterance? And so here I've given just a very rough sketch of how you might do this in number 5 at the bottom of page 1, if you're just getting your handout. So the presupposed content of English I, this is informal, might be that use of I presupposes that there's a, now I'll tell you what, a weakly familiar discourse referent. A discourse referent is just, think of it as an index that interlocutors use, something, actually information in their common ground about somebody that's evident to them all in its existence, and in the case of the speaker, present and speaking. Yes? So a discourse referent is just an index that identifies a particular body of information purportedly about a single individual. There's more to say about discourse reference, and I'll say it a little later. But in this case, it doesn't matter that much. So it presupposes that the interlocutors know about some particular individual. I'm giving it the index I here, and I'm calling it a discourse referent, D sub I, such that in all the worlds in the common ground, the value assigned to that discourse referent by a usual assignment of values to variables, G, is the speaker at the time of utterance. So that's what's presupposed when I say I on this anaphoric account, that we have information that there is a speaker and something else about who that is. Yeah? Okay. And then the semantic content, and that will give you a rigid designator, right? From all possible worlds in the, say, the context set to the same individual that we have pinned down to as being the speaker. And at any given world in the common ground, the semantic content of the, I said demonstrative I, the indexical I, is the value assigned to that discourse referent, that familiar presupposed discourse referent. So this is just like Kaplan's character going to give you a constant function, right? From worlds to whoever we know is actually speaking. Yeah? And you'd use the same sort of thing for you, for here, for now. And this is very commonly, as I said, developed on page 2. I've given you some references for people who develop accounts along these general lines. This retains the desirable features of the direct reference account, truth at all circumstances of utterance, without necessity, like I am here now. Again, that results from the pragmatics of what it is to be a speaker at a time and so forth, and presumably the interlocutors have that information in their common ground, etc. And it also gives you the desirable fixed reference under modality by a presuppositional anchoring to the actual speaker and addressee. And I call these pseudoscope effects, and I'll explain why in a moment. So we have numbers 6 and 7. So Stalnaker and Chomsky are sitting at opposite ends of a long table on a stage at MIT. One audience member says to another, if he had changed places with Noam, that guy, pointing to Stalnaker, would be a linguist. So it's silly, right? Why is that? Because that guy picks out the actual Noam Chomsky, right? The actual Robert Stalnaker. And no matter what he does about changing places on the stage, he's not going to become a linguist, right? So that gives you that effect, that gives you the effect of fixed wide scope. And it's going to give you the same effect as the constant function assigned to an indexical by Kaplan. Similarly, if Laura is speaking, if Calvin were speaking now instead of me, I would be a boy. Similarly silly, right? So here in 6, we have the usual demonstrative fixed reference cases, and here in 7, we have one with the first person singular pronoun. Similarly silly, right? Just changing places. The actual speaker, who is Laura, who is a girl, doesn't become a boy. Yeah? Now, there are 2 ways in which, I'll explain the pseudoscope effect now. 2 ways in which a presupposition in an embedded context can be satisfied. Because remember now, instead of Kaplan's use of character, with first you pin down all the indexicals to the contextual factor in question, and then you assign, thereby give them their constant function value. Here we're saying that I itself has a presupposition that has to be satisfied, but we said it's one that has to be satisfied in the global context of utterance. It has to be the actual speaker. And that's only one way in which a presupposition can be satisfied, and we see the two types illustrated in 8 and 9. Mr. Smith has decided to give Josiane a raise. If he has spilled the beans, she should be happy. Now, spilled the beans, if you're not a native speaker, is a slang for saying, you know, told her the secret, right? But I didn't want her to be in the antecedent of the conditional here. It's just for illustration, so that's why I use this slangy thing. Anyway, she, what's its antecedent? It has to have an antecedent. It's anaphoric, right? And the only available person, female singular person, is Josiane from the previous utterance. And so because that presupposition is satisfied there, it's going to seem as if she was wide scope, yeah, over the conditional. But in 9, Mr. Smith doesn't consider gender equity in determining what to pay his employees. If a woman gets any raise at all, she should be happy. Now, what's the antecedent for she? I mean, I'm just asking you to check with your own intuitions, and you'll see that it's the arbitrary woman introduced by an indefinite in the antecedent of the conditional, yes? And now we get the effect as if she is not something that we're globally familiar with, because its antecedent is under the scope of the modal, the conditional rather, yes? So now we say that that presupposition was locally satisfied. It was satisfied under the scope of the conditional, okay? And we see something similar with definite descriptions in 10 and 11. If you park a car on a steep hill, engage the emergency brake. What's the emergency brake? Well, you take it that cars have emergency brakes, and so the antecedent in the if clause has a car. Our common knowledge entails that it has an emergency brake, and we take that to be the antecedent for this anaphoric definite description. Now, that's very different than 11. If the gears on this car tend to slip, the gears on this car tend to slip. If you park it on a hill, engage the emergency brake. Now the emergency brake anchors back to, takes as its antecedent the emergency brake that we infer exists for the car that is this car in the first utterance. Now, when I was a pup, to get the truth conditions right for that conditional, because we took the emergency brake not to be anaphoric back in those bad old days, but to be just a usual old Russellian definite description, you'd have to scope that puppy out of the conditional, give it wide scope to get the right truth conditions, right? We don't do that anymore. In most of linguistics, it's assumed that for that particular definite description at least, it's anaphoric on that wide scope car. And that anaphoric relationship that is satisfied in a way that's wider, if you will, than is prior to the conditional, gives it pseudoscope. The definite description doesn't go anywhere any more than the pronoun does in the preceding example. With she in 9, instead, it just gets its presuppositions satisfied globally, okay? And that's what the difference between global and local context, and that's really important for the story I'm going to tell today, and it's important for the way in which the anaphoric account of indexicals works here. So the context that prior to the utterance of a sentence you might call the global context, and the global context plus the if clause in these conditional examples is the local context for the interpretation of the main clause of the conditional. And there's no merely local satisfaction possible for English I and you. They're always anchored to the actual speaker and addressee, which are already familiar in the context of discourse. Then they're always globally satisfied, and so they always seem to have this wide scope. That's the idea, technically, for these accounts. And this is another thing that we can't go into technically here. Operators in the proffered content, what you might think of as the content that's asserted or questioned or whatever, the proffered content, those operators only interact in compositional semantics and hence logically with proffered content. Presupposed content doesn't count. So if you've got this thing anchored wide scope, it's never going to seem to take a relative scope compared to the other operators in the proffered content, so it seems to take wide scope. That's the pseudoscope, okay? Okay, Now, here's some problems for these two kinds of theories of indexicality that I just briefly sketched to you. The first is the problem of shifted indexicals, which many of you may have heard of. They've become quite famous again over the last couple decades in linguistics. Here's a schematic example comparing the Amharic first-person pronoun to English I. The situation to be reported is John says, quote, "I am a hero." Yes? In English, 12b, you have to say John says that he is a hero. You can't say John says that I'm a hero, right? That would not correctly report that circumstance. But Amharic, you can say John says that first person am a hero. Okay? And that can mean John says that John is a hero. Okay? John as the speaker of the reported content, the reported event of speech. Okay? And here's some actual examples in 13 and 14, both with first person and second person Amharic. I'm not going to go through them in detail because, like I said, that would take us a little while. But I've given you the schematic about what really happens in 12. And these were not originally the observation was in Judith Schlenker, but he's the one who recognized the theoretical importance of these kinds of shifting pronouns. And it turns out they occur in a very wide range of languages, many of them completely unrelated all around the world. And he says, these embedded clauses are not quoted. This was very important that he shows this. So if you look at the really Amharic equivalent of 12a in 13, you know that that attitude report complement is not quoted, and he has syntactic evidence that that is the case, okay? So it's not direct quotation. And shifting is optional in Amharic. There are a lot of different, again, we don't have time, a lot of different languages. In some of them, shifting is sometimes obligatory, in others it's optional. Different languages permit you to shift under different embedding predicates. All of the languages that have shifting indexicals permitted under verbs of saying, but some also under attitude predicates like think and believe and others, okay? So it differs from language to language which contexts license the shift, but they all occur under verbs of saying, okay? So that's interesting and prima facie problem for Kaplan because this is not something where at the outset you take the speaker, you assign that as the value of, or the rigid value of the first person indexical and then go on from there. You have to do the compositional semantics to know that it's embedded under say and who the subject of say is before you can see what the options for interpreting the first person pronoun are. And on page 3, there's another feature of indexicals that isn't captured by either the direct reference or simple anaphoric theories. This is that, as I claimed at the outset, they lead to self-ascriptive de-se interpretations. This idea going back to Castaneda's early work in the 66. Here's a context from, and here's an example that I like that was developed by a linguist, Jerry Morgan, and it's a slight variation on his, but essentially. The context is there's this real baseball player, Ernie Banks. He really was a real guy. He gets hit on the head and develops total amnesia in this story. This is not a true story. He doesn't know his name or remember anything about his past, though he is lucid. During his long recuperation in the hospital, he reads in the newspapers about a baseball player named Ernie Banks and becomes fascinated with this guy's career. His social worker reports to a nurse. Now, Ernie's not there, right? Ernie Banks thinks he's one of the greatest shortstops of all time. Okay, now think about that. There's one sense in which that's true and another in which it's false. But on both of them, he is co-referential with Ernie Banks, and both the nurse and the social worker know that. So that's the crucial thing that Castaneda first observed. All right? Now, one of the interpretations is the non-de-se. Banks believes that that guy, Ernie Banks, is a great shortstop. The other is the de-se interpretation. Banks believes that he himself is the great shortstop. And the reason why that's not a possible interpretation here for the interlocutors is that both of them know that he doesn't know that he is Ernie Banks. Okay? So, both our interpretations have Banks and he co-referential, and the interlocutors know this, so this is really important. There's something beyond co-reference here in this example. And then consider these extensions. These are mine. In 16, spoken by the nurse in the context described in 13, Ernie Banks believes what he would mean if he now said, I am one of the greatest shortstops of all time. It is true. He believes that what he would mean if he now said that, I am one of the greatest shortstops of all time, is true. Okay? So, think about that. Do you think that's true? If he said now, in that circumstance, I am one of the greatest shortstops of all time, counterfactually, would that be true? No. He doesn't know he's Banks. He doesn't know he ever played baseball. Then it's true, though, that Ernie Banks believes what he would mean if he now said, Ernie Banks is one of the greatest shortstops of all time is true. Yeah? So, there's the puzzle. 17 is clearly true, but 16 is not. Direct reference predicts 16 to be true because the Kaplanian semantics for I makes it denote the actual speaker in the speech situation reported. Here, the counterfactual situation where Banks utters 18. I am one of the greatest shortstops of all time. Since the meaning of I there is just a constant function from worlds in the interlocutor's context set to Ernie Banks, then that has exactly the same truth conditions as Ernie Banks is one of the greatest shortstops of all time. Okay? And that, so I show how that follows in 18 prime. So 16 asserts that Banks believes that proposition, which he does, since we know from 17, so 16 is incorrectly predicted to be true. That's because direct reference fails to get at the de se character of indexicals. In uttering 18, Banks would self-locate as the great shortstop, and mere co-reference does not suffice to capture this self-location. Okay? So just see the puzzle, all right? Now here's a possible pragmatic fix suggested by Andy Egan, and that's what I call, he doesn't, a speech act account of the self-ascriptive properties of I. Paraphrasing, a competent speaker who knows the character of I, in using it, consciously knows that it will directly refer to the actual speaker. Moreover, he knows that he is that speaker. Hence, he knows that in using I, he self-ascribes whatever properties are predicated of that subject. Okay? So think about what that would say about the counterfactual. Ernie Banks believes what he would mean if he now counterfactually said, I am one of the greatest shortstops of all time. That may be technically truth conditionally true, but if he said it, there's a pragmatic factor, which is that he would know, assuming he's not hypnotized and he's conscious, he would know that he was saying it, and he would know thereby that he was self-ascribing it, so that's a pragmatic fix. If he said that, he would know that that was true, false, not true. Yes? Okay. So, okay, we grant this pragmatic fix. I'll come back to that. But the problem goes deeper. For one thing, shifted indexicals in every language study, and there must be about 25 of them now and growing all the time, always yield a de se interpretation, wherein the embedding agent self-ascribes the properties predicated of the indexical. In the Amharic translation of 19, Ernie Banks told me that he is one of the greatest shortstops of all time. He may be replaced with the first person singular, me, and the result is de se. Okay? But, so he goes, well, that's a verb of saying, right? So there's just some pragmatics associated with that, the same ones that we just saw in Egan's pragmatic fix. But 19 does not involve direct quotation, so it doesn't entail that Ernie said, the first person singular, okay? That could be a correct report without him using the first person singular, right? And hence that pragmatic account isn't clearly available across the general range of reports of the form 19. Moreover, and even deeper, this is on top of page 4, in several languages that have shifted indexicals, the embedding verbs are not all verbs of saying, but include the translation counterparts of other attitude predicates, including think, want, consider, and other attitudes. And in none of these cases is an extended speech act account plausible, because there's no speaking, so there's no knowing by the agent that they spoke it, hence they say. Okay? Nonetheless, the resulting attributions are always they say. Okay? So even if you think, and I do think that that pragmatic explanation is the reason or part of the reason why the indexicals are they say, I concede that. But as a general account of the de se property of indexicals, it fails, because it doesn't apply to all these other cases across a wide variety of languages. I'm going to skip this more linguistic evidence because I know I'm not going to have time to get through all this. You can look at it later. It's quite clear here. So then, so in order, this is my conclusion here, in order to capture the meaning of indexicals, we have to capture their de se semantics, right? So section 3, some background on centered worlds and discourse centers as the basis for a de se account. Again, this will be quick, but I'm just giving you a sketch of the path that I'm treading on the way to a de se account. The original accounts of de se first de Quine actually thought of using centered worlds, but it was really first developed in David Lewis's Attitudes de Dicto and de se with the two gods on the mountaintops. If you know it, it's a great paper. A centered world, and here you have an ordered pair of a world and an x sub 0, x sub 0 is going to be an individual, is compatible with what the agent X believes in a world W if X thinks in W that she might be the X sub 0 here in W sub 0. In other words, I'm sorry, the ordered pair was W sub 0 and X sub 0. So it's compatible with what the agent X believes in a world W if X believes in W that she might be X sub 0 in W sub 0. In other words, X's beliefs do not exclude the possibility that she is that individual X sub 0 in that world W sub 0. Okay? An agent X believes de se in W that she has property F if in every world center world individual pair compatible with what she believes in W, it's such that the agent, what we're going to call the center, X sub 0, has the property F in the world of the centered world. Okay? So to believe a centered proposition, which is a set of centered worlds, P is for every centered world compatible with what one believes to be contained in that set of centered worlds, P. Yeah? Now, in what follows, I'm going to use a relation over worlds. It's an accessibility relation, docs. It's the Hintican doxastic accessibility relation. It takes an agent A at a time T in a world W and yields a set of worlds, those in which every proposition that A believes that T in W is true. So this is the doxastic accessibility relation, and we're going to then generalize that to cover doxastic accessibility over centered worlds. Right? So a belief state is a pair consisting of a centered world and its dox-related belief set. The base world time is the world of utterance and the doxastic agent, okay? And that's an ordered pair as usual, and you call the agent the center, okay? And then the belief set is a set of centered worlds, and these are of the same type as the base world, a set of a world and an individual. And here's the way I think of it. You can read through the text. It's that as we don't really know where we are, right? And it's as if you were driving on an interstate highway, and you stop at the rest stop, and you find a map, and you don't know where you are on the interstate, and you can see where everything is on the map, like Lewis's gods. They were propositionally omniscient, right? And they knew every true proposition. But what they didn't know was which god they were, which is to say they didn't have a little red arrow on the map that said, you are here. You could have been the god on the tallest mountain or the god on the warmest mountain, in his example, right? So the center is the little red arrow that says, this is who you are in this world. And that's what Lewis's center, going back to Quine, gives you. Self-location on that doxastic map, that map of the way things might be in logical space. Okay, so now Stalnaker modifies this, and I'm not going to talk about it in detail. Again, I highly recommend it. This is in his 2007 something of the knowledge of the external world. Very, very useful book, and a very nice short discussion of this in the book. But he also has a set of worlds and subjects and times, and a relation that's in linear order over times, and a set of centered worlds with the center is actually an individual at a time, I'm going to often gloss over the time in this discussion, but a center really, because my beliefs now will be different than my beliefs later that were different than my beliefs 10 years ago, right? So you have the doxastic agent is really an individual at a time, and then in the world in which they hold these beliefs, and then the accessibility relation is to a set of centered worlds that reflect those beliefs. And the center in each is my I am here now flag in those worlds. But there's one difference from Lewis's account, which is a really crucial difference, and it's an important one if you're going to develop a truth conditional, broadly applicable semantic account using these. Stalnaker has this principle he calls STAR. It's right after 6 on the little list of description of Stalnaker's account. And it says basically that if you have two centered worlds, I think I call them here, C prime, W prime, and C double prime, W prime. So notice that in those two pairs, you have the same world, W prime. And C prime versus C double prime, he says if you have such a centered world in your belief set, that C prime equals C double prime. In other words, you can only, on Stalnaker's account, have one center per world. And as he puts it, the main difference from Lewis's model is that ignorance or uncertainty about where one is in the world is always also ignorance or uncertainty about what world one is in. This has important ramifications for the Stalnakerian account, and among other virtues, I have some bullet points here, it permits us, the problem for Lewis is, the belief set for one centered world agent, if you don't have STAR, if you permit multiple centered worlds with the same world in them, that's what he does. He says that the gods in his story know exactly what world they're in propositionally, but they have two centered worlds with the same world, but different centers, okay? And each of them, neither of them knows which of the two centers they are. That's what he says. But the problem is then the belief set of one agent becomes incomparable to belief sets of other agents. You can't compare the belief sets of one agent at one time with their belief set at another time, etc. And Stalnaker in the book goes through why this is a problem in detail. And you can't really just simply think of the complements of attitudes, abstracting away from the de se, as sets of possible worlds, i.e. propositions in Stalnaker's sense, and he wants to do that for good reason, because we don't always just want to think about the centered content. So for all these reasons, he says we add the STAR component. Okay? So that's the notion of doxastic state that I'm henceforth going to assume. I think it's an important thing to recognize as a problem, and I'm willing to adopt his solution, although I really don't know what I'm subscribing to by way of epistemology or etc. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't deep issues here, but it's a solution that works for me, and that's something I'm happy with. Okay. So we assume these centered worlds. We assume, now we're going to have to talk about the logical form that leads to de se or non-de se interpretations. What distinguishes between the two? We've seen they're truth conditionally different. One can be true, the other false. The non-de se in Ernie Banks' case is true, the de se false. So we have to distinguish them somewhere. Where are we going to do that, and how are we going to do that? And the first thing you might think of is it's a function of co-indexation in logical form. So here we have the two readings of 15 at the bottom of page 5. Ernie Banks thinks he's one of the great shortstops of all time. Let's see this circle C stand for the arbitrary center, okay? Then we have the non-de se interpretation. Ernie Banks and at world W believes, so you have the ordered pair Ernie believing at world W, and that will give you his belief set, right? So when you apply believe, which is basically like docs, to that ordered pair, you get a belief set. And this says that that has to be a subset of the set of centered worlds where Ernie Banks is a great shortstop at the world in the centered world. All right? That's the non-de se interpretation. But compare that to the de se, the belief set has to be a subset of the set of centered worlds where the center is a great shortstop in that centered world. Yep? Now there's the de se. There's a self-location, the little red map, the little red arrow is on the center and says that that individual has the property of being a great shortstop. Okay? So you get the simple idea. Yeah? Then how do we derive the de se reading, the desired reading, from the LF of the utterance in question? First pass. The de se reading of a pronominal embedded under an attitude arises if and only if the pronominal is co-indexed with the agent of the attitude. Sounds like a simple idea, right? Page 6. So we have in 15 prime, Ernie Banks thinks that he is one of the greatest shortstops of all time. If the index on he, which is K, is equivalent to that on Ernie Banks, we get the de se under this simple proposal. And if it's not equivalent, we get the non-de se. Yeah? Simple idea? Okay, cool. But there's a couple of problems with this. This is where the linguist comes up. Right? Co-indexation and the binding it reflects are neither necessary nor sufficient for deriving a de se interpretation. Yeah? In other words, you can have cases where you know from independent reasons in the semantics of the utterance that the pronoun and the antecedent, the agent antecedent, are not co-indexed for other reasons, yet you get a de se, so it's not necessary. And there are cases where they have to be co-indexed, but you don't get a de se interpretation, right? If that's the case, then we have to find another solution to the problem of the de se. Yeah? Okay. What time is it? Where am I? I have 25 minutes. Is that right?
Okay.
Is that right? Till 2:30?
Yeah, till 2:30.
Okay, good. We can get through most of this, at least in outline form. Why isn't it sufficient to guarantee the de se interpretation? This is on page 6, 3.2.1.
Until 3:30.
That's what I meant. The half hour. Consider the following variant on an example drew to my colleague at NYU, Chris Collins. The context: in the amnesia ward, there's been an epidemic. Each of the patients was a renowned, successful person before losing his memory. Each obsessively reads books and articles about the famous person he was, not realizing that this was him. This couldn't be your colleagues, right? One nurse tells another, each of these guys thinks he's great. Okay? Now I ask you, could you get a non-de se interpretation of that? Where each of these guys thinks that the person he's been reading about, who he actually is but doesn't know it, is great. Sure can, right? But notice, you gotta co-index the two things if co-indexation is central to binding. And if it isn't central to binding, I don't know what it is, right? So you've gotta co-index he and these guys, each of these guys, yet we want to get a non-de se interpretation. So this shows you that you can co-index all you want, and that won't guarantee the de se. You can bind, in other words, and not get the de se. Yeah? So now, let's look at one thing I wanted to note, which is there's a pragmatic perspective operator, which I'm going to essentially use in the semantics of the de se semantics for the indexicals, and I want to introduce you to it at this juncture. Yeah? And that's in 3.2.2. And I take the essential insight that examples like the 21 that we just looked at to offer to be intimately related to work on de re belief attribution due to Maria Aloni. I really like this work. We only ever hold an attitude toward an entity under some, she doesn't use this term, but I think it's a good one. We only hold an attitude toward an entity under a guise. Yeah? We never know a res completely. Yeah? The amnesiac Ernie Banks, for example, is familiar with Ernie Banks under at least two different guises. In one, he's a great shortstop who plays for Chicago. In another, he's his own self, as presently embodied in the hospital bed, blah, blah, blah. Yeah? He hasn't recognized that the two are guises of the same individual. I think that's an intuitive characterization of these de re belief attribution problems. And Aloni proposes, and she argues in great detail for the particular proposal she makes and the character of this perspective operator, which she's going to propose to yield de re shifts in attribution. And this perspective operator, in her account, takes a res, an individual, and an agent who holds an attitude toward the res, and yields the guise of the res with respect to which the agent holds the attitudes. So she puts a lot of other extra constraints on it, really good constraints that need to be observed, but I don't have time to discuss them here. But effectively, you take the individual concept, that's the meaning of the either proper name or a description or whatever it is, pronoun even, and you have a perspective operator that operates on it, and that yields the guise under which the agent is familiar, which might not be something they would recognize as the proper name, say, at all. Okay? Extending that work, we can talk about the self-identity guise with a distinguished perspective operator, which I call P-self, which assigns that self-identity guise relative to a given doxastic center to that center itself. All right? So just to outline what I'm going to do, I'm going to give a characterization of the perspective operator. Ohlone makes hers purely pragmatic, and I'm going to put syntactico-semantic constraints on its applicability here. But it's still pragmatic in my account. I'm going to propose a way of modeling this operator in my framework, and I'm going to say that to get the day-say reading, you have to assume that this self-identity guise applies in this case. So that's pragmatics. It's not given by the syntax, because if it were, well, I don't know what else you would use besides a special operator somewhere, an abstract operator in logical form, or something like co-indexation but with special indices, and I'm not going to go either of those paths. So here, a guise is a function from individual concepts, functions from worlds to individuals, from individual concepts to individual concepts, constrained to reflect a conceptual cover. This is what Ohlane's P operator gives you. Hence, and mine's going to be very little because I have to take into account discourse reference. So my P-self is going to be a pragmatically given perspective operator in her sense. And it's a variant on the less constrained concept generators of Perkins and Sauerland, if you know their work on that. So theirs just aren't constrained in the same way that Ohlane's are. Then self-attribution by a center, this center is an agent at a time, AT, as directed towards the rest B in the world, W, is the recognition of the rest by the agent under a particular guise, the reflexive self guise in all of A's belief worlds. In other words, that rest is going to have to be the center in all of those belief worlds. Yeah? So remember, the center is the self-identity. Here, this is me. Now, I told you this, I have discourse reference, and those are of type SE, functions from, they denote things, functions from worlds or situations to individuals, an individual concept. And those are assigned values by assignment functions, as in Heim's early work. And at any given point in discourse, we only use assignment functions that are consistent with, reflect all the information the interlocutors have shared up to that point, including information about the properties they would ascribe to these individuals they've been talking about, as represented by the discourse reference. The discourse reference are what she called her file, right? The individuals that we're keeping track of in discourse. We have information about them. And any assignment function that's consistent with our common information at that point, what I'm going to call a CS consistent assignment, context set consistent assignment, is going to reflect all we know about that discourse reference. Right? Okay. So we track information shared about these discourse reference by requiring that the only admissible assignment functions at a given juncture give values to the relevant discourse reference that verify all the information we have about them. And so that's the CS consistent set of assignments, those that respect all that information. So on page 7, we can now define the self guise as follows. We have this P self, it's a function. Instead of just a function from individual concepts to individual concepts, I'm going to want to anchor this thing in discourse information, okay? So I'm going to say that it takes two arguments, not just an individual concept, but first of all, a centered world and a discourse referent. So the discourse referent is such that that discourse referent reflects, at any given world in the context set, is the agent of the centered world. Right? And then it yields an interpretation of that discourse referent such that in all the belief worlds of that agent, effectively the discourse referent yields the center as its interpretation. Yeah? So if it takes he, Ernie Banks, and they're co-indexed with the agent of the attitude, Ernie Banks thinks that he, the P-self operator is going to take the discourse referent for he, which is co-indexed with Ernie Banks or not, just as long as they're co-referential. And it's going to say that in any interpretation in the worlds that are accessed via the attitude that the he is embedded under, the value of he will be the center. Not just co-referential. Remember we saw that the non-Daisy interpretation, Ernie Banks is the center, but it's in the centered worlds, it's all we require of them is that Ernie Banks is a great shortstop, and Ernie Banks isn't necessarily the center. We want the interpretation where that Ernie Banks becomes the center. And that's what P-self does. Instead of going through the technical details, that's what it does. Okay? So, if we embed, let's see, consider, so what we get in 15 here on page 7 is that if we applied P-self in the Daisy interpretation, you're going to get the interpretation we want, where in all the belief set of Ernie Banks, where Ernie Banks is the agent of the attitude, the center is a great shortstop in the belief, in the world of the belief set, and that's going to be the Daisy. Okay. And then if we consider Banks' counterfactual statement in 4, but assume that a speaker typically knows that he's speaking and therefore bears the P-self perspective on himself qua speaker, Egan's observation, then we yield the interpretation shown in 18 in the middle of page 7, where Ernie Banks thinks that P-self is great in all of his, in other words, the center is great in all of his belief worlds. And that's the Daisy interpretation, and it explains why it's actually formalizing in a way, except it doesn't just constrain it to speech situations. It formalizes the idea here, in this case, that the speaker knows that the speaker is speaking. Yeah? Okay. So then we make 16 false. But in a shifted indexical language, the P-self associated with the embedded first-person pronoun may be anchored to one of two centers, either the speaker or the embedding agent. And if it's anchored to the embedding agent, we get that Ernie Banks thinks that first person in Amharic, am a great shortstop. You get the Daisy interpretation, because P-self would be brought along with the first person. Yeah? But if you don't use P-self, you get the non-Daisy interpretation. Ernie Banks thinks that Ernie Banks is a great shortstop. Don't puzzle too much about it. Co-indexation and co-reference are not sufficient. You already saw that when I first presented the Daisy, non-Daisy distinction. And what P-self does, if it's applied pragmatically, guarantees the Daisy interpretation, if they're co-referential. Okay. Now, why isn't co-indexation necessary to guarantee the Daisy interpretation? I can get rid of this more quickly on page 8. Once we have the pragmatically triggered P-self operator, what would preclude our applying it to an argument not co-indexed with the embedding agent, yielding the non-Daisy? So long as they're co-referential, they don't have to be co-indexed, right? That's the idea. Well, in fact, there's evidence that we need to do this. And here's the example, number 22. Ernie Banks thinks that only he is his devoted fan. Okay, now this is a case where we have a strict, sloppy ambiguity. Forget Daisy for just a moment. The strict reading, this is an old terminology from linguistics, the strict reading is that Ernie Banks believes that no one other than Ernie Banks is a devoted fan of Ernie Banks. Yeah? Can you get that interpretation for the example? The sloppy reading is one where Ernie Banks believes that no one other than he has this reflexive property of being a devoted fan of himself. Okay? And you can get that interpretation, I think. I'm not going to go through all the readings that I can get. Some of them in this little chart table below, I've laid them out. But the one that's highlighted is the one that's problematic for the current issue, which is where both pronouns have a Daisy interpretation, but you can have a strict interpretation in the other dimension, in the strict sloppy. Okay? So in other words, the meaning that you would have is that no one other than Ernie Banks thinks that Ernie Banks is a devoted fan of Ernie Banks, where both of them, he himself does believe that he is a fan of himself. So he could only hold that property, after that belief, after he has come back from the amnesia. Okay? So if you can get that interpretation, which I can, then that shows that they're not co-indexed under, because, oh, I didn't say this, duh. Usually in linguistics, the strict interpretation is yielded by making the two noun phrases in question not co-indexed, but taking them to simply be accidentally co-referential is the term that Tanya Reinhardt used. Whereas the sloppy interpretation, you take them to be co-indexed. Beg pardon, I should have said that earlier. Okay? So if you can get the strict they say interpretation, that shows that they're not co-indexed, but they're both they say. Okay? Hence, co-indexation is not necessary. And we should be able to apply the P-self independently to both the pronouns. Now, we're starting to run short of time, and it doesn't matter how much of the rest of this I get through, but I'm going to go through I, say a couple comments about we, and then make just a few general comments about what this tells us about indexicality and perspectival expressions more generally. If you look on page 8 and section 4, here's what I call the character of English I. Now this is in honor of Kaplan, but it's not Kaplan's character, obviously. But it still has, there's two dimensions of meaning here. Given you have a context, and I explained in the paper what it is, but I'll tell you here what those aspects are without you having to go through it. With the discourse referent D sub SP for the speaker, and the T star and W star for the actual time and the world of utterance. Okay, so then there's the presupposed content and the proffered content. Now clearly, I'm going to want to make this anaphoric, right? So it's going to be related to the anaphoric semantics for the indexicals that we looked at in the first section, okay? And that means there's going to be an anaphoric presupposition. But it's going to be more interesting than the presupposition that we saw in the merely anaphoric case, because it's going to presuppose that use of I is felicitous in the context K and the actual world and time, just in case the discourse, there's a discourse referent co-indexed with I, so I said use of I sub I. So I have this index I on the first person singular pronoun, and that there has to be a discourse referent with that. This is called a familiarity presupposition in anaphoric. That's typical. And for all CS consistent assignments, in other words, assignments of values to variables that are consistent with the information that the interlocutors have about these discourse referents, the value of the discourse referent that's co-indexed with I is the same as the value of the discourse referent for the speaker. In other words, they're the same constant function from worlds in the context set to the person that we happen to know as the speaker. Okay? They don't have to be co-indexed. They just have to be co-extensive across the worlds in the context set. And an extra condition here, we give as the value of I the P self of the agent of this attitude, which is the speaker, because I'm saying any speaker is making an assertion is making a pseudo-doxastic commitment following Stalnaker, and relative to the discourse referent I. In other words, in any of the doxastic worlds corresponding to the speaker, the value of the first person singular pronoun is going to have to be the same as the center in those worlds. Okay? So this is the self-location that Egan's noticing, right? And so given that it's going to guarantee that I is going to be de se. Yeah? Now, the proffered content is very simple. It's just that when it's felicitous, for all CS consistent assignments, the value of I in the context is just going to yield the value of that discourse referent, DI. So I did all the work in the presuppositional content. Yeah? All the work. The requirement that it's anaphoric and the requirement that it's perspectival. Yeah? I built in the anaphoric observation that gives you pseudoscope, and I built in, hence, wide scope relative to modals, blah, blah, and I built in the de se-ness using my P-self. Now, wait a minute. Why, if we already observed that P-self follows in the case of the English first-person pronoun and second-person, etc., if that follows from contextually available information, why not just make it, you don't have to build it into the presupposed content of the character of the expression, surely, right? Why build it in? Isn't that redundant? No, for two reasons. First of all, what we're going to see when we go down to the Amharic, which I give at the bottom of page 9 and I won't get to, there, just don't look at it. I'm going to use P-self on the first person pronoun relative to whoever the anchoring agent is. But in Amharic, it can either be the actual speaker, or it can be the agent of the embedding attitude. And that's going to happen across all the languages and all the different predicates that license the embedding shifting indexicals, and hence things that would not pragmatically yield the self-locative effects that we get from actual speech acts that Egan observed. Yeah? So what I'm doing is I'm saying that this is a general feature of what it is to be indexical. And what it is to be indexical involves self-location in an essential way, and that, I think, has bled over into all these indexicals that get shifted in languages where it shifts. So in order to reflect that, I'm going to put it in English as well as in these other languages, say this is what it is to be an indexical, is to be perspectively anchored to the agent of a distinguished attitude, where the speaker and addressee are always available agents of attitude. You can think of the context that Stalnaker talks about this in his more recent book in 2014. You can think of this agents of the context set as a pseudo-doxastic set, right? The state of purported common belief of the interlocutors, right? So both interlocutors are agents of that attitude, if you will. So they're always salient and evident, and in all these languages that shift, it's the embedding agent. That's one reason why I wanted to put P-self into the semantics for I. Well, what's another one? Let me give you a thought experiment. You're philosophers, you love thought experiments. Suppose that I'm God, and I have designed a new language, a human language, observing all the generative, known, universal grammar and constraints and everything. And we're almost ready to go online, but at the end I say, oh, wait a minute, now I have my full vocabulary assembled here in heaven. I said, wait a minute, you, and you're going to get presuppositions. Go over with Michael, he'll assign them to you. The rest of you, you're just proffered only, go on, get out to work. Yeah? What is ludicrous about that situation? I don't have time to convince you of this today, but this is what I now believe. Presuppositions in general are they're not conventional. They're not conventionally assigned to the meaning of as the meaning of a particular form. Now, proffered content is. So the fact that in English, a particular doxastic attitude is reflected as know, and another one's reflected as believe, is arbitrary. And the fact that in French you use connaître and croire, which are completely different word forms, that what Saussure called l'arbitraire du signe, the arbitrariness of the sign associated with the meaning, that's there for proffered content, yeah? But presupposed content is different. Typically, it's either functionally presupposed, so it has to do with the fact that, in the case of anaphoric elements, they have to have a presupposition or you can't retrieve the intended content, the meaning intended by the speaker. Or I think of them as conceptual presuppositions, like what would it be to discover something if it didn't pre-exist? It's inherent to the meaning of discover that the thing was true beforehand, and that has a bearing on the fact that cross languages discover seems to always trigger the presupposition of the truth of the complement, etc. So I'm not going to convince you of that today, but I think if you look seriously, you're going to see that presuppositions are not arbitrary. They're associated in functionally interesting ways with the meanings, the proffered content that the expression carries. So by incorporating this into the presupposed content of the indexical I, I'm simply reflecting what I take to be a fact, which is what Egan was reporting, right? But that fact has a bearing on why that gets extended as a presupposition of first-person singulars in shifted indexical languages, and something similar happens for second. So just one more minute, because I'm not going to be able to tell you everything that's on the sheet on page 9. One of the things I do is tell you that although these are anaphoric, indexicals can't take just any antecedent, unlike a third-person pronoun like he. In fact, they have to have one of the things that I call a discourse center, because they are perspectival. That means they presuppose an antecedent that has a particular contextually salient doxastic perspective. What's a doxastic perspective? Well, look on page 10. Here, a little table at the bottom, I have a table that says, generally, if you're going to characterize a space, if it's Cartesian space, spatial, you have a space, here the physical space in the Cartesian case, an origin, which is a location in that physical space, a point of view, the anchor's location, you might think of that like for front, you have the point of view of the anchor, right? So that's an orientation from the center within the space, yes? Okay, and you have a perspective, and I might think of that in physical spaces. Here I am, I'm at the origin in this physical space. I have this orientation opposed to that one or that one, and then because of my pragmatics of what it is to be a visual agent, I have a certain range of perception, and that's the accessible space, okay? And that's what I call the perspective. And there's a lot of work on this by one of our students from Ohio State, Jefferson Barlow, which I referred to below, in a language called Mushanguli, comparing it to English. But notice that you can metaphorically extend this to a notion of doxastic space and perspective in doxastic space. And that's what I'm actually doing here. And Barlow has done this work to show that deictic motion verbs like come work with that same metaphoric extension in both English and Mushanguli, with slightly interesting differences. So the space in the doxastic case is the set of possible worlds, the set of ways things might be. The origin is the base-centered world, the world in which the agent has the belief or attitude, doxastically based attitude. The point of view is the base world and the doxastic relation, right, which is going to give you an orientation. And the perspective is the belief set, the set of accessible possible worlds in that space. So that's the doxastic perspective. It's the set, your belief set in that world, time, from the perspective of the agent. Okay? And then I've applied that, in this case, to the indexicals, in other work, to epistemic modals, Jefferson to deictic motion verbs, some work that Jefferson and Eric Snyder and I did on predicates of personal taste, where we use a slightly different notion, not doxastic. So the idea is this is a very generally applicable idea, that there's a notion of location at an origin, and in the case of the doxastic case, this is self-location. And it plays a role across. My claim is about what an indexical is in the middle of the last page. An indexical is an expression whose interpretation conventionally presupposes a relation to the doxastic point of view of a contextually available discourse center, its anchor. Yeah? Okay. So now, by the way, if you've ever read a lot of the literature on context sensitivity in philosophy, one of the things that used to puzzle me is that they would talk about indexicality, but they weren't talking about what I'm talking about as indexicals here, like I, you, here. Now, they're talking generally about things that get their values contextually, like pronouns, generally. On this account, no. And how do I show the difference between them? And that goes back to what I call the discourse centers. I'm interested in agents whose perspective, in this sense, is immediately salient in the discourse. So those agents include, among the set of available discourse reference, the things whose properties are known, that are agents that are capable of holding attitudes, always the speaker and hearer. Under the scope of an attitude verb, you introduce the discourse referent to the set of centers, the discourse referent for that agent of the attitude. And in certain other kinds of literary contexts, and even sometimes orally, you have a free indirect discourse type case where you adopt the perspective of some third person. Like if you're an author, you can say, it's an 18th century novel, you say, John was now upset. Mary was in London. Now what would he do? She would never come back here, blah, blah, blah. So the now and the he, blah, 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 are anchored to John's time, space, and perspective, and not that of the author. So a great deal has been written about that. So that the agent of such a free and direct discourse stretch is also a discourse center at that juncture. The set of available antecedents for indexicals like as I told you, are the set of available centers at that point. And this set is dynamic. It's always the speaker and addressee, but it changes because speakers change. And under the scope of an attitude, you add the agent of the attitude, but when you're no longer under the scope of the attitude, that goes away. And you see in free and direct discourse that during the stretch of discourse that reflects that perspective of the third person, that center is available as a set of things that can anchor indexicals. Now, they never in English anchor I or you, but I just gave you an example where they anchor here and now and a variety of other indexical expressions. So some English indexicals are shiftable, yeah, and others are not. And that differs from language to language. In all the shifting languages, all of them have at least I that shifts, but some have you, some have here, some have now, some don't. And they have different verbs that license the shifting. So there is a conventional linguistic constraint on shiftability and which centers are available as anchor that differ from language to language as a function of the specific semantics of the shifting indexical item. That's the hypothesis. And I have a whole bunch written about that to try to generalize it over the shifting indexical cases across languages. So this is an account of what I'm going to call perspective. And of the claim that, in particular, de se is a reflection of a perspective, in this case, a doxastic perspective, as opposed to a spatial one for locative expressions, and that this is broadly applicable not only to indexicals, but to a much wider range of linguistic components. By the way, you may not know this if you're a philosopher, there's a long literature in linguistics of people trying to pin down what all these things have in common. It's been observed for a long time that modals, epistemic modals in particular, and indexicals and locatives, intuitively all have something in common. It's called localism, this old idea that goes back to the early 20th century, at least if not the 19th in France. But nobody has been able to model it properly or satisfactorily. And I'll give you some references there, but I think this is a promising way to begin to model localism and to capture the de se character of the indexicals as a subcase of that localist perspective. So that's what I'm up to. Thank you.